Stanford just released a big study that we thought was interesting, and we wanted to share it with you guys. This is an article from the New York Post. It says the Stanford study, quote, has found those who did strength training lost more fat and had better blood sugar maintenance than those who did cardio or a combination of both. Researchers from Stanford University looked at nearly 200 people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes who participated in a 9-month exercise routine of strength training, cardio, or both. Findings published in the journal Diabetologia.
Oh,
wow.
I've got a subscription to that. Showed that the group that went through just strength training exercises had better progress doing workouts such as shoulder presses and leg presses 3 times a week compared to those who utilized the treadmill, elliptical, or stationary bike. One workout of strength training might not stave off as many calories as a cardio workout, but because it builds muscle tissue, which requires more energy to maintain, it can ultimately burn more calories overall. Okay. That article did not mention diabetes, or at least the portion that I read, but you said that was part of the study.
Mm-hmm. Huge part of the study.
Okay, so once again, we can't just trust headlines because they left that out.
Yeah, so the title of the study, Strength Training is More Effective Than Aerobic Exercise for Improving Glycemic Control and Body Composition in People with Normal Weight, Type 2 Diabetes, a randomized control trial. That's a beautiful title. They got to do a better job with the titles.
They do. I like that it tells you what it's studying, but at the same time, okay, so people with type 2 diabetes, normal weight, strength training alone does a better job of controlling blood sugar long term.
So this was, to be clear, this was an article in the New York Post that cited this other study. So that the New York Post, they didn't bring anything.
They liked the clickbaity headline.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so go ahead.
So much of the research that's out there is specifically looking at, exercise interventions like this, type 2 diabetic or non-diabetic. They often look at what will these given, aerobic exercise interventions, strength interventions, combination interventions, what will they do for individuals with obesity or overweight?
Sure.
And so the fact, it sounds so innocuous, it sounds so whatever, but there is I think in the study it talks about there being a 20 or 25% of individuals with type 2 diabetes have normal BMI. And so there's this assumption that, okay, what else can we do for them as far as exercise goes? If they already have their BMI is good, they must be physically in an optimal state.
Sure.
Let's say. But so for them to take this specific subset and, randomize them to some different, some specific exercise interventions, I thought was very useful. Now the study ended up being underpowered. This was conducted during the heat of COVID shutdowns. And so it ended up, cutting their
interventions
in half or something.
Oh, wow.
So I think they were shooting for 200 or 300 participants. I think that was more like 150 or 180.
Wow.
Something like that. So it ended up hurting them. And therefore we have to be cautious in what we extrapolate from this. But as always, we look to the overarching body of research to see if this, just kind of see where does this point. If it pointed the opposite way,
right,
then you could say, okay, interesting. But we know it's underpowered. It's a small study, needs some follow-up, needs something a little sturdier. But also if it points in that direction, you kind of say the same thing. But at the same time, I think even what they mention is that it can allow us to further personalize exercise recommendations. And so in this case, again, people with type 2 diabetes at a normal BMI, which is a huge population.
Yeah.
So, that's sort of the gist of it from that end.
So what's the punchline? How much of a difference did strength training make versus the other interventions?
Mm-hmm. So the primary outcome was the absolute change in hemoglobin A1C.
That's a big deal for type 2 diabetics.
Yeah. And so they looked at this at 3, 6, and 9 months out.
Mm-hmm.
The secondary outcomes included changes in body composition at 9 months. So
that wasn't the primary goal, but it was a secondary measurement. Okay.
And so what they saw was that most notably there was greater reductions in hemoglobin A1C in the strength only group versus the combination group, which was strength training and aerobic training,
right? And
versus the aerobic training by itself.
That's interesting.
And so again, it brings about that idea that there's something to be said about the muscle mass that we have, and also the attainment of muscle mass. There's something going on in resistance training, not only just packing on the muscle mass, but also in the process of doing it. There's something to be said about a variety of health outcomes, especially when we're looking at something like, hemoglobin A1C, which is your average blood glucose over X amount of time.
Right.
And so it's proof that there's, it converges on the evidence that already says there's a major whole body insulin sensitization that can occur with resistance training and with physical activity in general.
Okay. So going way outside of my realm of knowledge, just based on what I've learned doing this show with you, the muscles themselves, the muscle tissue absorbs the glucose out of the blood, correct?
Essentially, yes.
So is the thinking then that by creating more muscle, you're able to absorb more glucose out of the bloodstream?
Essentially, yes.
That makes a lot of sense, but that's fascinating that
it all points in that direction. And now that's one, there are other mechanisms at play in the periphery. They call it, in one paper, they talk about it as organ crosstalk. So it's not just not just the muscle and the glucose and the benefit, and that's it. There are things happening in the pancreas. There's things happening in circulation.
Yeah, it's a complex system.
Yes, there's a system. There's a systemic, change occurring. But if we want to look at what's the benefit of building muscle tissue, I think you're absolutely right in that there is an increase in glucose uptake from the blood by building muscle and doing the stuff.
Yeah,
I think some of that goes away as you stop exercising.
Sure.
But continuing to do the thing, you can continue to realize those benefits.
That's great.
For sure.
So this, again, you said this was specifically for normal body weight, type 2 diabetics. Is there any reason to think that this wouldn't be true for everybody? Whether you're diabetic or not?
There are probably studies that look at the changes in glycemic. There are studies that show that there's an improved capacity for glycemic control in non-diabetics. It's just that taking your hemoglobin A1C from out of the normal range to lower in the non-normal range to potentially back into the normal range, versus if you're somebody already at a good level to further reduce it. I know you're reducing a lab value, let's say.
Right.
But clinically, what is that doing? I don't know. It's certainly not harming you.
Right.
And sure. I think there's this analogy everywhere, and it applies here, that when you don't just stop taking your blood pressure medication when your blood pressure normalizes.
Right.
Ideally, you don't just stop doing, you know what I mean? You don't just stop the intervention as soon as it works. It's the continuation of that.
I might have every once in a while. But.
Yeah. That's actually not even really what I wanted to say, but it's really just this analogy of the physical 401k. So you continue to bank the volume, you continue to bank the exercise, you view it as just this accumulation of good behaviors and physical characteristics.
Yeah.
Then it puts you it makes you more resilient against, maybe some of these negative changes in this context to maybe glycemic control.
Sure.
So it's tough. A very long answer to say that it probably helps in the normal.
Yeah.
In the normal population and the healthy subjects. But again, just keeping it focused here, I do like that it, again, it highlights a group that is they say relatively sarcopenic. So,
what does that mean? Sarcopenic.
So essentially have a decrease in muscle and they have a decrease in the capability of the muscle. So they're under muscled essentially.
Okay.
And so that's I think that's another big point of this is.
So maybe
it's
that's
one thing, it's in the other way that they highlighted this was that in the other studies, individuals with obesity, overweight, type 2 diabetics, they have higher fat mass percentage.
right.
But they also, because of just the added body weight, they actually do carry higher amounts of lean mass.
Yes.
And so that in and of itself kind of knocks them out of the sarcopenic category.
Interesting.
And in those, in studies where they've done similar interventions, they don't see necessarily as high of a benefit on hemoglobin A1C from strength training alone. In that overweight, obese category, you see more of a benefit in combination. You see more of a benefit in aerobic training.
Sure.
And so maybe that just comes back to this idea of potentially individualizing treatment, or again, you want to get to the point where you're doing all of these things. You're getting to the point you want to do a lot of all of these things, but it's hard to get somebody to do all of these things and a lot of these things sustainably and for the long term. So when you're working with somebody or you're working with yourself, what's the low hanging fruit? What's going to maybe get me the most benefit the soonest?
Right.
I'm not saying that this paper gives us that answer 100%, but again, type 2 diabetic, normal weight. What's the harm in focusing on putting on some lean mass first?
Yeah.
And then eventually building in a little more conditioning, building a little more resistance training. So because eventually you got to move the needle anyway. You got to progress anyway. It's just, again, I like it from the perspective of individualizing it, recommendations.
I like what you just said there, because that was the next question, of course, is, well, if this is what has the biggest bang for the buck, then I don't ever have to run again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying, no, it's all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
But for someone who has that specific shortcoming or need, take those low-hanging fruits. It's hard enough to start any new habit. It's nearly impossible to start multiple new habits at the same time, especially things that need to be lifestyle changes over a very long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, forget all that. Just focus on the one thing that is going to give you the biggest response in the short term first.
Mm-hmm.
Develop that habit, gain some benefits, and then move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
What else? Anything else in this?
There's quite a bit. I think that, again, we could probably talk about a lot of this for a long time.
What were the interventions, the exercises specifically that they really liked for the strength training and all that jazz? Yeah,
the one part that really stuck out to me was the sheer volume that they gave to the strength training only group. Okay. So it was 3 days a week, 9 exercises per session.
9 exercises per session? How many sets per exercise?
So it was 4 exercises times 2 sets each, upper body, 3 leg exercises times 3 sets each, 1 lower back exercise times 2 sets, 1 core, 1 abdominal exercise times 2 sets. So
it's 29 sets or 21 sets if I just did my math right.
It's a lot of sets.
Did they walk after this, or
right?
Are they still mobile?
They claim the intensity of the strength training program was low initially to reduce muscle soreness.
Yeah, go figure.
And ensure proper lifting form. I like to think that I've done a decent amount of exercise, or at least I'm tolerating exercise right now.
Yes.
That if you gave me this routine, 21 sets, it's probably going to make the second session and the third session of the week probably kind of crappy.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm interpreting it wrong. Maybe they titrated them up to that point.
Sure.
I don't think that they did. So, they say, oh yeah, well, we increased the intensity slowly. So they're saying we increased the loading slowly, and that's fine.
Start with small weights, go to bigger ones.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But that's one piece. I mean, you could if you did 3 sets of 10 on an exercise, I don't care how light it is, 3 sets of 10 on an exercise you never do,
right?
No matter how light it is, there's probably going to be some delayed soreness in the days to come.
Do some air squats.
It's going to get worse. Yeah. It's going to get worse if you're obviously operating at a higher intensity.
Sure.
But just by watching the intensity, progressing the intensity, doesn't mean that they probably beat some of these people up.
Yeah. So these are intense exercises that they went through, and it was you said 9-month study?
It was. And so they made to that end, they made it seem like they, adequately followed up with everybody over that period. Again, with the biggest limitation being that they had everybody set up at a community facility, like a, LA Fitness or YMCA. Everybody was set up there. But then, 2 weeks into the program, everybody had to go home and do stuff because of the shelter in place. So that's a big deal. I mean, you go from having 50 machines and barbells and treadmills and bikes at your disposal to at home, stuff in your living room. It's not nothing, but it's a major change.
But that actually probably suggests that this would have been even more effective
potentially
had they been able to have the uninterrupted base time, full workouts.
Yeah. The other in these interventions, maybe one of the last things I wanted to mention were the differences between groups a little more granularly. So we talked about the 21 sets or whatever for the strength training group specifically. So from what I can tell in the combination group, in order to, I think, allow for better tolerance of that added exercise.
Combination group being elliptical or bike and strength training.
Yes. So again, there was the strength group, all strength stuff, as we just mentioned, combo, like you mentioned, conditioning plus strength, and then just conditioning. So it appears that the dose of strength training was lower in the combination group than it was in the strength training group.
Okay.
So I would be curious to see, would the outcomes as far as hemoglobin A1C lowering, would it have been higher if the volume were equated across groups?
Oh, sure.
Obviously, the aerobic training group, you're controlling for aerobic training specifically. Of course, there's not going to be any benefit or any
strength training in that. That's a good point. So for example, having the 21 sets on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then maybe doing the conditioning on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday.
Yep.
And doing the same amounts of everything.
Yeah. Again, I want to say, in the combination group, participants were instructed to complete 2 strength training sessions per week, including 1 set of each of the strength training exercises, plus expend 42 kilojoules kilogram body weight per week through aerobic exercise using the same protocol as aerobic exercise. So the aerobic group was the same in both groups.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So from aerobic by itself to strength training and aerobic was the same, but the strength training protocols, I assume just by default, because of the limited amount of time, resources it takes a lot of time to do a lot of conditioning and a lot of strength training. So I see why they did that, but I think just right at the outset there,
that's a huge drop off too.
Volume, oftentimes the results that you get from training are volume and dose dependent. So if volume is not equated, we might presume that you're going to have a bit of a different outcome.
So that's a bit of a limitation of the study.
Yeah. Again, we talked about the primary outcome, which was the hemoglobin A1C lowering. The other thing that was interesting was the secondary outcome, which looked a little more at body composition. Specifically, what they looked at was the appendicular lean mass. And so for those that don't know what that is, we're talking about a very specific measurement. You can look at whole body lean mass, but it factors in organs and total body water, all types of that. So if we look at ALM, which Atia talks about a lot too, it's the sum of the lean tissue in the arms and legs. Okay. So it's just a more direct measurement of muscle in your extremities, basically.
Yeah.
The higher amount of lean mass that you had, that was an additional independent predictor of lowering hemoglobin A1C. So again, just in addition to the strength training in and of itself causing a lowering, they felt if they controlled directly for just that increase in lean muscle mass, that conferred a benefit.
There was a corollary directly between the benefit and the amount of muscle mass gained.
Yep. The act of gaining muscle and the muscle itself in this study was
predictive.
Doing things.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah. So it's, again, if it's a small study, can't really like run home with it that it just changed the whole scope of clinical practice as it relates to strength training and aerobic training, but it points in the direction that we sort of already know.
Yep.
And that's glycemic control is a real lever that can be pulled when adding physical activity. It truly makes a difference. And now we have a nice small snapshot at a very specific population who, maybe the eye test, they're within normal body weight, they're within normal BMI. What else can we do for them physically? Obviously, we want them to exercise. Hey, for that person, for the first 12 weeks, for the first 9 months, let's say, like this study, let's skew the dosing of strength training for that person.
Yeah, let's focus on that thing.
Not to say we don't bring in all the other stuff. It's just, useful in that regard.
That's fantastic.